Long ago, in a beautiful city, there lived a man named Mulla Nasruddin, known far and wide for his simplicity and wisdom. He was always ready to help people, but some took advantage of his kind nature. In that same city lived a wealthy merchant named Saifuddin. He had no shortage of money, but he was greedy and deceitful by nature. A few months earlier, Saifuddin had claimed his business was suffering losses and borrowed a large sum from Mulla Nasruddin. Without hesitation, Mullah had given him the money out of sympathy. But once he had the money in hand, Saifuddin's attitude completely changed. Whenever he saw Mullah on the street, he would either change his path or make up an excuse about being sick to avoid him. One day, while walking through the market, Mullah saw Saifuddin cheerfully inviting people to a grand feast at his palace the following Friday evening, boasting that the finest food in the city would be served. Mulla Nasruddin approached him and gently asked when he planned to start. Repaying the loan since he badly needed the money, Saifuddin, putting on a look of false distress, brushed off Mullah's hand and claimed an old friend was paying for the feast, and that he himself didn't even have a single coin to repay the debt. He was in dire financial straits. Mulla Nasruddin realized Saifuddin was lying and was using his very own money to throw this lavish feast. Just then, the city's judge Qazi Zubair, a fair and law-abiding man who knew nothing of this deception, happened to pass by. Saifuddin immediately greeted him with great respect and invited him to be the guest of honor at the feast. The Qazi smiled and accepted. Mulla Nasruddin quietly watched the two of them, and an idea began forming in his mind. This was the perfect opportunity to teach Saifuddin a lesson and expose the truth in front of the judge. When Mulla Nasruddin mentioned he too would attend the feast, Saifuddin simply laughed it off, not realizing this feast would become the greatest mistake of his life. On Friday evening, Saifuddin's palace glittered with lights, expensive lanterns, and torches illuminating costly carpets. Wealthy merchants and officials arrived in fine clothes, and Saifuddin greeted each guest at the door, swelling with pride that the whole city was praising his grand home, all while secretly gloating that he'd built this reputation with Mulla Nasruddin's money and never repaid a single coin, feeling not the slightest shame. Just before the feast began, Qazi Zubair arrived with great dignity. Saifuddin rushed to kiss his hand and welcomed him, and the Qazi praised the magnificent arrangements, remarking that Saifuddin's business must be thriving. Saifuddin, lying through his teeth, modestly credited it all to the blessings of great men, like the Qazi. Suddenly, all eyes turned to the palace's grand entrance. Mulla Nasruddin had arrived, but his appearance left everyone stunned. He wore his usual simple, tattered clothes, but around his neck hung a huge, heavy, old wooden cartwheel, weighing his neck down. In his hand, he carried an empty clay pot, which he shook gently, producing an odd rattling sound. Guests began whispering and laughing, mocking Mulla Nasruddin's bizarre getup, wondering what could possibly be wrong with him. When Saifuddin saw Mullah in this state, he grew furious, feeling his honor was at stake. Certain Mullah had come to humiliate him in front of everyone. He shouted at Mulla Nasruddin, demanding to know what this spectacle meant and why he'd come to such a grand feast with a wooden wheel around his neck, mocking him in front of all the guests, and ordered him to remove it and leave at once. Mullah looked innocently toward Qazi Zubair, who had risen from his seat in astonishment to see what was happening, and replied loudly enough for everyone to hear. He said he was simply addressing his friend's troubles. When he'd asked for his loan back in the market, Saifuddin had claimed he was penniless and in financial distress. Mullah explained that he'd assumed such a poor merchant. Throwing such a grand feast must mean his business was about to collapse under crushing debt, so he'd brought the wheel so that, when the weight of his debts became too much, Mulla Nasruddin could personally help pull his cart along and save him from disgrace. The moment Mullah finished speaking, Qazi Zubair's ears perked up sharply, and the color drained from Saifuddin's face, as if the blood had left his body entirely. A heavy silence fell over the hall. The guests who had been laughing moments before suddenly fell quiet, and every eye turned to Saifuddin, who was sinking into the ground with shame and fear. The pride and grandeur he'd been feeling shattered in an instant. Qazi Zubair, a deeply wise, devout, and justice-loving man, fixed Saifuddin with a piercing gaze and demanded to know, in a thunderous voice, whether there was any truth to what Mullah had said. Had he truly borrowed a large sum from this honest, humble man? And if he had no money to repay it, where had the wealth for this extravagant feast come from? The question landed like a court verdict. Saifuddin's hands and feet began to tremble, and sweat beaded on his forehead. Desperate to avoid disgrace, he reached into his coat and pulled out a pouch full of gold coins. With trembling hands, he held it out to Mulla Nasruddin, begging him to end this spectacle and take his full repayment, claiming the pouch even held 10 coins more than the debt, and pleading with Mullah to take his wheel and empty pot, and leave quietly without ruining his reputation. Mullah took the heavy pouch, shook it once to hear the coins jingle, but to everyone's utter shock, instead of putting it in his own bag, he placed it directly into Qazi Zubair's hands. Astonished, the Qazi asked why Mullah had handed over his own rightful money to him. Mulla Nasruddin replied with a knowing smile that without the scales of justice, these gold coins meant nothing more to him than dirt. He asked the Qazi to examine the pouch carefully, and to ask this cunning merchant why, if he truly had so much wealth, he had withheld Mullah's loan for 2 months, and not just his loan, but that hidden behind this grand feast lay a much larger deception. One it was now the Qazi's duty to uncover. Qazi Zubair grasped the depth of Mulla Nasruddin's words and slammed the pouch of coins onto the table. He turned such a fierce, judgmental look on Saifuddin that the merchant's knees began to shake. Roaring, the Qazi demanded the whole truth about this lavish feast. Seeing no way left to escape with his lies, Saifuddin collapsed to the ground in tears and confessed. He admitted his own business had completely collapsed, and that he'd deceitfully borrowed money from many ordinary people in the city. He'd thrown this extravagant feast purely so that wealthy officials and merchants would see his grand home and lend him even larger sums, with the real plan being to take that money and flee the city entirely. Furious, Qazi Zubair declared that Saifuddin was not merely a merchant, but the greatest fraud in the city. He immediately summoned the royal guards and ordered Saifuddin chained and thrown into prison. He further commanded that the palace, all its treasures, and the entire feast be seized and distributed among the city's orphans, and poor until every person Saifuddin had cheated was repaid in full. The guards seized Saifuddin and dragged him away in chains. Mulla Nasruddin calmly removed the heavy wooden wheel from his neck and set it down beside Saifuddin's gilded throne. Turning to Qazi Zubair, he said that anyone who throws a feast on money stolen from others will eventually find their own cartwheel, leading them straight to disgrace. The Qazi praised Mullah's honesty, and Mulla Nasruddin left the palace, shaking his empty clay pot, smiling. Cheating others and using borrowed wealth to display false grandeur leads only to disgrace. A person may deceive others through cunning, but God's justice and wisdom will, sooner or later, tear away the veil of every lie.